Okay, let's dive in. We've gathered some really fascinating source material today, all looking at the haunted history of New York State.
Yeah, the whole skate.
But we're not just doing the typical ghost tour stuff. Our idea here is to use these famous hauntings, these legends, almost like a map, to find something, frankly, much darker. The actual factual history, the trauma, the violence, the tragedies that maybe New York tried to sweep under the rug.
That's exactly the mission. We're not taking the ghost stories as, the end point. They're pointers, historical markers.
Right.
Because behind almost every famous ghost, every shadowy figure legend, there's usually some documented history. Awful stuff like institutional abuse, murder, or just huge amounts of suffering that were never really dealt with.
So we're tracing New York's, shadow timeline.
Pretty much. And going all over the state, not just Manhattan,
Neons.
Celebrity hauntings.
It's going to be quite a journey. We'll hit some famous residences tied to big names, obviously Stand by Violence like the Dakota, but also look at forgotten colonial history practically under our feet, and then these massive, horrifying institutional failures, especially upstate.
The history that sort of never left.
Exactly. History that never quite checked out. So let's start in Greenwich Village. Maybe New York's most tragically famous brownstone.
Yeah.
Okay, 14 West 10th Street. People immediately know the nickname, the House of Death. And the rumor, is it really 22 spirits they say are inside?
That's the number that gets thrown around, yeah. But for me, the real weight of that place, it starts with the documented horror, the 1987 tragedy.
Right, before we even get to the older stuff.
Exactly. I mean, yes, Mark Twain lived there briefly, 1900 to 1901.
Yeah.
And there are stories, he saw things, and people claim he still haunts the staircase, in his white suit. Classic celebrity ghost lore.
Sure.
But what really, really cemented the building's, truly terrifying reputation was the murder of 6-year-old Lisa Steinberg by her adoptive father.
Such a brutal story.
That violent, very modern tragedy. That's what sealed its horrific history for many people. It wasn't just old legends anymore.
And it feels like that built on something already there. I mean, didn't the psychic Jan Bryant Bartell write about her experiences there much earlier in the 70s?
In her book Spindrift, 1974, she detailed years of just torment she and her husband apparently went through living there.
So it suggests the building was, I don't know, collecting pain long before that specific crime.
It really shows how history layers, doesn't it? You've got the older, maybe literary ghosts right alongside this documented contemporary, just devastating violence.
That mix of celebrity and real-world tragedy seems key for a lot of these famous NYC buildings.
Definitely. Which brings us neatly to two huge rock and roll landmarks, in a way. The Dakota and the Hotel Chelsea.
The Dakota. Impossible not to think of John Lennon's assassination right outside in 1980.
And the building had its own spectral history even before that awful night. Lennon himself apparently claimed he saw figures there.
Oh.
Yeah, including someone he called the Crying Lady Ghost. She was later identified supposedly as Elise Vesley, who managed the building back in the 60s.
Huh.
So when Yoko Ono later reported seeing Lennon's spirit, I think she said he was sitting at his white piano, and told her, "Don't be afraid, I am still with you."
Wow.
In a way, she was describing him joining a sort of pre-existing ghostly roster there.
It's incredibly sad, isn't it? Thinking of Lennon, who was apparently quite interested in the paranormal himself, becoming part of that building's legend.
Yeah. It's a heavy thought.
Okay, shifting downtown a bit to the Hotel Chelsea, the ultimate artist's haven, but also a place linked to a lot of self-destruction.
Oh, the Chelsea. It's just a nexus of bohemian tragedy and maybe reckless living. Everyone knows the Sid Vicious connection, right? Nancy Spungen stabbing death there in 78. But if you look further back, the hotel has these other older ghosts of grief. There's a story of a woman named Mary. Her husband died on the Titanic.
Oh.
And the legend is she took her own life in the hotel afterwards. And then there's the poet Dylan Thomas.
Right, the White Horse Tavern connection.
Exactly. He had that massive drinking binge, starting at the tavern, collapsed back at the Chelsea, and died shortly after being rushed to the hospital.
Yeah.
The place is just, it's like a monument to lives that burned incredibly bright, but way too fast.
That's a lot for individual buildings to hold.
Okay.
Okay, changing gears slightly. You mentioned the sheer scale of tragedy in New York. Where's the biggest, maybe least acknowledged historical scar in the city? Because it can't just be confined to a few famous apartments.
No, absolutely not. I think the single largest and maybe most unsettling example of that buried history is right under Washington Square Park.
The park with the arch.
That exact spot. Everyone sees the fountain, the students, the performers, what they're walking on, sitting on. It's a massive forgotten potter's field, a mass burial ground.
Okay, wait. What kind of scale are we talking about here? How many people?
The estimates are, well, they're staggering. Maybe as many as 20,000 bodies buried right there beneath the park.
20,000.
Yep. It was used heavily, especially during the yellow fever epidemics, late 1790s through the early 1820s. It was the place for the city's poor, the unknown victims of disease.
And isn't it true that they've actually found remains there, like recently?
They have. Even in the 21st century, during routine utility work or construction, human remains have been accidentally unearthed. It just shows how close to the surface this history really is.
That's incredible. This huge, central, vibrant park, literally paved over maybe 20,000 forgotten lives.
It really grounds that whole idea of New York hauntings, doesn't it? You're basically always walking over something tragic.
Yeah.
And if we move from that massive scale down to, say, a smaller stage, the entertainment world, Broadway specifically, has its own lingering spirits.
Yes, the ghosts who won't give up the spotlight. Tell us about Olive Thomas at the New Amsterdam Theater.
Right. Olive Thomas, she was a huge star as Ziegfeld Follies chorus girl. Died young, 1920, over in Paris. And the death itself was shocking, really bizarre.
How so?
She accidentally drank her husband's medication for syphilis. It was mercury bichloride, essentially a horrific poisoning.
Wait, mercury for syphilis? That sounds brutal.
Oh, incredibly. It was a really toxic early treatment, before penicillin. Fatal if ingested like that. A truly agonizing death.
God.
So, Steph, the New Amsterdam today, they believe her spirit is still there. But here's the interesting detail they always mention. She supposedly only appears to men.
Huh. Specific and painful. Maybe that's why she's tied to the theater.
Could be. Another big theatrical presence is David Belasco, haunting the theater named after him.
Right, the Bishop of Broadway.
Precisely. He got that nickname because he often wore like a clerical collar and a cassock.
Strange look for Broadway.
Yeah, but apparently he's still seen in that outfit. Watching performances from a box, sometimes people claim he even operates the elevator. His haunting seems less about tragedy, more like, professional possessiveness over his theater.
Keeping an eye on things. Okay, and then we have some really old history. St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. You can't get much more old New York than Peter Stuyvesant.
He's the big one there, yeah.
Yeah.
The famously grumpy, peg-legged Dutch colonial governor. He's buried right there. The church was built over his family's private chapel site.
And the stories about him are great.
Oh, they're fantastic. Legend says his ghost harasses the clergy, sometimes rings the church bells randomly, and people have even claimed to hear him singing Calvinist hymns in Dutch.
In Dutch. That's wonderfully specific, a real old-school haunting tied right to the historical figure. So we've seen celebrity violence, mass death under parks, lingering performers, but this kind of massive scale violence, it wasn't just in the city, right? When we look upstate, that's where the collective institutional pain really comes into focus, the asylums.
Yeah, the scale of institutional tragedy upstate is.
Yeah.
It's immense. Take Utica State Hospital. Opened way back in 1843. Started with, progressive ideals, but the reality of care became horrifying pretty quickly.
This is where the Utica crib comes in.
Exactly. The doctors there invented this device, the Utica crib. And it was just inhuman. A wooden, sometimes iron-barred cage used to confine patients deemed agitated, sometimes for days or even weeks.
Just the existence of something like that, it completely changes how you think about any haunting there. It's not just, a sad abandoned building. It's a documented site of torture.
Absolutely. And people who go here, the abandoned Main building today, Old Main, they report seeing faces in the windows, hearing screams. The kind of things you'd sadly expect given that history.
And it wasn't just Utica, right? This pattern seems statewide.
It really does. Look at Rolling Hills Asylum out in East Bethany. Started as a poorhouse in the early 1800s, later became an infirmary, basically a place to warehouse society's unwanted, the poor, mentally ill, the disabled.
But wasn't that used in a TV show?
Yeah, parts of it were apparently used as a filming location for American Horror Story. Asylum. Makes sense. Visitors now go looking for the Shadow People hallway, supposedly on the second floor of the East Wing.
It's this recurring theme, isn't it? Institutional failure across the state.
Definitely. You see similar awful stories down on Long Island, Pilgrim State Psychiatric Center. That place has a really dark history, too, particularly around the systemic use of lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Lots of deaths associated with that in the 50s.
So whether it's the Utica crib or the shadow people at Rolling Hills or lobotomies at Pilgrim State, these places are basically monuments to years of systemic abuse disguised as care.
That's a good way to put it, grim monuments.
Now, how does large-scale warfare fit into this map of New York trauma, connecting institutional failure to military history?
War creates these really specific, intense points of suffering on the landscape.
Yeah.
Fort William Henry Museum up near Lake George is a powerful example.
Even though the fort itself is a replica.
Right. The physical structure is from the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But it sits on the exact ground where a truly brutal massacre happened back in 1757 during the French and Indian War. The soil itself is just saturated with that violence.
And people report things there.
Oh, yeah. Visitors talk about feeling unseen hands pulling their hair, seeing shadow figures, capturing weird things in photos. The land remembers.
And that theme of mass suffering from war, we see it closer to the Civil War too, right? Near Elmira, Foster's Pond.
Yeah, the Elmira Civil War prison camp. Operated there from 1864 to 65. Conditions were just atrocious. Confederate prisoners crammed in unsanitary quarters, terrible exposure to weather.
The death rate was huge, wasn't it?
Astronomical. Nearly a quarter, 25% of the roughly 12,100 prisoners died. From disease, from exposure. Almost 4,000 men.
4,000?
Yeah. Initially buried in mass graves right there before being moved later. That sheer concentration of death, particularly forgotten military death, means people strongly feel the spirits of those soldiers remain tied to that original site.
Okay, finally, we have to touch on maybe the most famous horror story in the entire state. The Amityville house on Long Island. It's so sensationalized, it's almost hard to see the history through the movie versions. How do we ground that story?
You start with the undeniable fact. The core truth. Mass murder happened in that house.
Right.
In November 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his family while they slept. He later claimed voices in the house told them to do it. That is the historical anchor, that horror is real and documented.
And then came the Lutz family.
And then came the Lutzes, yeah. Moved in about a year later and famously fled after just 28 days. Reporting all the stuff that became legend, the weird smells, green slime oozing from walls, flies, cold spots, and their daughter Missy's imaginary demonic pig friend Jody with glowing red eyes.
The legend totally exploded from their account, obviously, but it all started with that incredibly horrific act of violence that marks the house no matter what.
Exactly. Whether you believe a word of the Lutz story or think it was a hoax, the site itself is unequivocally marked by an extreme act of familial violence. That makes it a true site of historical terror, regardless of the paranormal claims that followed. Hashtag outro.
And that really feels like the main takeaway here, doesn't it? These places we call haunted, maybe they're actually just geographical markers, signposts pointing to historical failure, historical pain, whether it's sudden violence in a famous home or decades of systemic abuse in a huge state asylum.
Yeah, I think if you strip away the ghost stories themselves, what you're often left with is just a map of New York's pain. War massacres, institutional neglect, epidemics, murder, entire communities literally buried under our parks and landmarks.
They're almost like memorials to the tragedies that society maybe tried really hard to forget or pave over.
Exactly, unofficial memorials.
We've covered so much ground. From the invention of the Utica crib to the 20,000 bodies possibly under Washington Square Park and the very specific sad end of Olive Thomas. It's a sobering look at the underside of the Empire State.
It is. And it really raises a final question, something for you, the listener, to think about. Given the sheer density of history in a place like New York, the age of it, and the number of documented tragedies we know happened, tragedies we walk over every single day, like those remains found in the park, prove.
Yeah.
What history, what stories, what suffering is still buried right now, just beneath the surface, waiting for its own ghosts, its own legends, to emerge and finally demand our attention in the next 50 or 100 years.